The most dangerous lie is the one told where everyone expects the truth. The courtroom in downtown Baltimore was so quiet that even the faint scrape of a chair echoed across the polished wood floor. 12 jurors watched without expression. Reporters sat with pens ready. The judge adjusted his glasses and nodded toward the witness stand, where Officer Daniel Brooks stood in full uniform, one hand resting on the Bible before lowering it calmly to the rail. His badge caught the morning light, reflecting the image of a man every person in that room had been taught to trust. His voice never trembled. Every sentence sounded measured, practiced, and believable. Across the room sat Naomi Carter, her wrists secured in standard handcuffs as required for a defendant during transport, her expression unreadable despite the eyes fixed upon her from every direction. She wore no expensive suit, no symbols of authority, nothing that suggested she possessed any influence at all. To the strangers filling the gallery, she appeared to be exactly what Officer Brooks described, another suspect whose story had finally caught up with her. Daniel inhaled slowly before speaking again, describing how he had supposedly discovered evidence connecting Naomi to an ongoing investigation. He explained every detail with remarkable confidence, pausing only long enough to allow each statement to settle into the minds of the jurors. Every answer seemed complete. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Even the prosecutor appeared impressed by how smoothly the testimony unfolded. But Naomi never interrupted. She never protested. She never shook her head or rolled her eyes. Instead, she listened with quiet patience, almost as though she were waiting for something far more important than the verdict itself. The silence surrounding her began to feel strangely deliberate. Imagine standing in that courtroom, hearing someone rewrite your story while knowing every word was false, yet refusing to speak because the truth required perfect timing instead of louder arguments. Most people would have demanded to be heard. Most people would have fought every accusation the moment it was spoken. Naomi simply watched Daniel with calm eyes that revealed nothing except remarkable self-control. One juror briefly glanced toward her, expecting anger or fear, but Naomi Carter remained perfectly still as the courtroom settled into an uneasy rhythm, her hands resting calmly despite the steel cuffs around her wrists. The quiet confidence that surrounded Officer Daniel Brooks continued to spread through the room like an invisible current. Every nod from the prosecutor, every line written by the reporters, and every glance exchanged between the spectators reinforced the same assumption. They believed they already understood who the honest person was and who deserved suspicion. Daniel welcomed those assumptions because they made his job easier. He had spent years learning that people often trusted certainty more than facts. As long as he spoke with enough conviction, few questioned the story he presented. He answered another series of questions with practiced precision, describing timelines that sounded organized and observations that appeared impossible to dispute. His uniform, his calm tone, and his polished confidence carried almost as much weight as the words themselves. The jurors listened carefully, occasionally writing notes of their own. Some avoided looking directly at Naomi, as though they had already decided she belonged exactly where she was sitting. Yet Naomi noticed everything. She watched the jurors without staring. She observed the court clerk organizing exhibits. She listened to the steady ticking of the clock mounted high on the wall. Even the soft hum of the ventilation system became another detail stored quietly in her mind. She had learned long ago that important moments rarely announced themselves with dramatic entrances. Sometimes they arrived disguised as ordinary seconds that everyone else ignored. Imagine knowing that every person in the room has formed an opinion about you before hearing your side, and still choosing patience instead of frustration. That kind of restraint cannot be improvised. It must be earned through discipline. Naomi carried herself with that discipline, refusing to allow emotion to interrupt careful observation. The defense attorney leaned closer and whispered that the opportunity to challenge the testimony would come soon. Naomi acknowledged him with only the slightest nod before returning her attention to Daniel. There was no panic in her eyes. No desperation. Only quiet calculation. Daniel interpreted her silence as surrender. In his experience, people who knew they were losing often stopped arguing. That assumption gave him even greater confidence. He added another statement to his testimony, speaking carefully enough to sound sincere while never realizing that every additional detail narrowed his own path of escape. Near the rear of the courtroom, a middle-aged man wearing a plain grey suit entered without drawing attention. He carried a slim leather portfolio and quietly took a seat along the back wall. Moments later, a woman dressed in equally simple business attire stepped through the same doorway and remained standing beside the entrance for only a few seconds before sitting several rows away. Neither exchanged greetings with Naomi. Neither spoke to anyone else. To everyone watching, they appeared to be ordinary observers attending another public hearing. Only Naomi noticed their precise arrival times. Her expression did not change, but her breathing slowed ever so slightly. The pieces she had been waiting for were beginning to move into place. Meanwhile, Daniel smiled politely after finishing another answer, convinced the courtroom was following the script he had written. He believed he was guiding the narrative toward an unavoidable conclusion. He never considered that someone else had quietly been following an entirely different script from the very beginning, one that depended not on what Naomi would say, but on everything he willingly chose to say himself. Officer Daniel Brooks settled deeper into the witness chair, his confidence growing with every question that came from the prosecutor. The rhythm of the hearing now belonged entirely to him, or so he believed. He answered without hesitation, adding details that painted Naomi Carter as someone who had deliberately interfered with an active investigation. Every sentence sounded polished. Every explanation seemed carefully connected to the last. To anyone hearing the testimony for the first time, it formed a complete picture. The jurors exchanged brief glances before returning their attention to Daniel, and several members of the gallery nodded almost unconsciously as though each new statement simply confirmed what they had already expected to hear. Naomi remained silent, her posture unchanged, her eyes resting calmly on the witness stand. She did not challenge his words. She did not whisper to her attorney. She simply listened. Imagine watching someone confidently build a story around you while knowing that every new sentence quietly moves them closer to a mistake they cannot take back. Most people think lies become safer when they are repeated. In reality, every unnecessary detail creates another thread that can eventually be pulled apart. Daniel did not realize that he had crossed that invisible line several minutes earlier. Instead of limiting his testimony to verified facts, he continued expanding the narrative. He described conversations that supposedly took place in a parking garage. He claimed Naomi attempted to conceal important information during questioning. He even recalled exact times and precise locations with remarkable certainty, unaware that such precision would later become impossible to defend. The prosecutor appeared satisfied, smiling slightly as another exhibit was presented to the court. A large monitor displayed photographs, reports, and official paperwork that seemed to support the government's position. Reporters typed rapidly, eager to publish the latest developments before the afternoon edition closed. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from uncertainty toward confidence. Many believed the case was already decided. Yet beneath that appearance of certainty, small details quietly refused to fit together. Naomi noticed one juror frown while comparing 2 pages of testimony. The defense attorney noticed a timestamp that did not perfectly match another document. Near the rear entrance, the man carrying the leather portfolio glanced briefly toward the courtroom clock before lowering his eyes again. None of these moments attracted attention on their own, but together they formed the beginning of a pattern that only a handful of people could recognize. Daniel mistook the silence for agreement. Encouraged by the lack of resistance, he volunteered additional information that had never been requested. He insisted that Naomi had acted alone. He confidently stated that no federal agency had ever contacted his department regarding the investigation. He even declared that every action taken during her arrest had followed department policy from beginning to end. Those words lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Naomi finally shifted her gaze from the witness stand to the judge's bench for only a moment before looking back at Daniel. Her expression remained composed, but there was now something different behind her calm eyes. It was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was recognition. She had just heard exactly what she needed to hear. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney quietly closed his notebook instead of adding another page of notes. The simple motion went unnoticed by nearly everyone present. Daniel certainly missed it. He believed he had strengthened his credibility beyond challenge. He could not see that every confident answer had slowly transformed the witness stand into the very place where the foundation beneath him had begun to crack. The defense attorney slowly rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the center of the courtroom with deliberate confidence. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer filled with certainty. It carried the subtle weight of expectation. He thanked Officer Daniel Brooks for his testimony before asking what appeared to be a routine question about the sequence of events on the afternoon of Naomi Carter's arrest. Daniel answered immediately, repeating the timeline he had already presented. His voice remained steady. His posture never changed. He believed consistency alone would convince everyone that he was telling the truth. The attorney nodded politely and asked another question, this time about the patrol vehicle camera. Daniel explained that the recording system had experienced a temporary malfunction and therefore captured only limited footage. The explanation sounded reasonable enough that several jurors quietly accepted it without hesitation. The attorney simply thanked him again and moved to another subject. He asked about body camera recordings. Daniel confidently stated that technical problems had affected that equipment as well. Once again, his answer appeared smooth and complete. Imagine watching someone solve every difficult question with an answer that sounds perfect, never realizing that perfection itself can become suspicious. Real memories often contain uncertainty. Manufactured stories rarely do. The attorney paused for several seconds before requesting permission from the judge to display several exhibits already admitted into evidence. A series of photographs appeared on the courtroom monitor. The first showed the hallway outside the evidence room. The second displayed a digital log from the courthouse security system. The third contained dispatch records listing exact arrival and departure times. None of the exhibits appeared dramatic. In fact, most people in the gallery struggled to understand why they mattered at all. Daniel watched them with relaxed confidence, convinced they supported his version of events. Naomi quietly observed every reaction inside the courtroom instead of looking at the screen. She noticed one juror slowly lean forward. Another began comparing two separate pages of handwritten notes. Even the court reporter briefly glanced toward the monitor before returning to the transcript. Tiny shifts. Barely noticeable. Yet each one suggested that certainty was beginning to weaken. The attorney asked Daniel whether he was absolutely certain that no federal investigator had contacted his department before Naomi's arrest. Daniel answered without hesitation. He declared that no such communication had ever taken place. He repeated the statement even after the attorney carefully asked the same question using different wording. The answer never changed. Daniel appeared almost proud of his consistency. The attorney thanked him once more before quietly returning to counsel table. He did not celebrate. He did not argue. He simply organized a thin folder containing several unopened documents and placed it neatly beside his legal pad. Naomi watched the folder for only an instant before lowering her eyes again. She already knew what rested inside. Around the courtroom, whispers never began, but an invisible tension slowly settled over the gallery. Something about the questioning had changed the atmosphere without anyone fully understanding why. Daniel sensed none of it. He smiled politely toward the prosecutor, believing the most difficult part of the hearing had already passed. What he failed to notice was that the questions had never been designed to challenge his story. They had been carefully designed to preserve it exactly as he told it, locking every detail into the official record before the next chapter of the morning quietly arrived. The courtroom settled into another long silence after the defense attorney returned to his seat. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Even the reporters who had been writing almost continuously slowed their pace, sensing that the direction of the hearing had shifted in ways they could not yet explain. Officer Daniel Brooks remained composed, convinced that silence favored the person who appeared most confident. He adjusted his posture and looked briefly toward the judge, expecting the proceedings to move exactly as they had throughout the morning. Instead, the judge reviewed several pages of notes before quietly asking whether either side intended to introduce additional evidence before testimony concluded. The prosecutor immediately answered that the government's case remained strong and that Officer Brooks had presented a clear and reliable account supported by official documentation. Those words echoed through the courtroom with reassuring certainty. Daniel allowed himself the smallest hint of satisfaction. He believed the hardest questions were now behind him. Across the room, Naomi Carter remained remarkably calm. Her attention drifted toward the large courtroom windows where thin rays of afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floor. She seemed almost detached from the arguments unfolding around her, as though she understood that timing mattered more than emotion. Imagine carrying the truth inside you while everyone around you embraces a carefully constructed illusion. There comes a moment when speaking too early accomplishes nothing, because people only recognize the truth after they have fully committed themselves to believing something else. Naomi had learned that lesson years before, and today she refused to interrupt the process. The defense attorney quietly leaned toward her and whispered only a few words. Naomi answered with a slight nod before looking once more toward the rear of the courtroom. The same man carrying the leather portfolio remained seated without drawing attention to himself. The woman in business attire had not moved either. To everyone else, they were simply members of the public observing another criminal proceeding. Yet their patience seemed almost deliberate, as though they were waiting for a specific moment rather than following the testimony itself. The courtroom clerk received a small sealed envelope from a courthouse employee and placed it neatly beside the judge without opening it. The exchange lasted only seconds. Most people never noticed it. Daniel certainly did not. His attention remained fixed on the prosecutor, who appeared ready to conclude direct examination. The judge carefully examined the envelope before placing it aside unopened, his expression revealing nothing. That single decision created another subtle ripple across the room. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did her attorney. Neither reacted outwardly. Daniel interpreted the judge's calm demeanor as further confirmation that nothing unexpected remained. He had spent years believing that preparation meant controlling every answer. What he never considered was that preparation sometimes meant allowing another person to speak uninterrupted until every important statement became part of the permanent record. The gallery remained unusually quiet. Even those who had entered expecting an ordinary hearing now sensed that something invisible was unfolding beneath the surface. They could not identify it. They could only feel it. The atmosphere had become strangely heavy. Not because anyone had raised their voice, but because certainty itself seemed to be losing its balance. Daniel smiled politely when the prosecutor assured the court that the testimony had established a complete picture of the events in question. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment before looking toward the courtroom doors once again. Somewhere beyond those closed doors, the final piece of a much larger story was already making its way down the hallway, and when it arrived, the questions inside this courtroom would no longer be about what Naomi Carter had supposedly done. They would become questions about who had been telling the truth from the very beginning. The courtroom doors opened so quietly that only a handful of people turned their heads at first. The judge paused before speaking, watching as a court officer approached the bench carrying a sealed authorization folder that had just been delivered through official channels. A brief conversation followed in voices too low for the gallery to hear. The judge examined the documents carefully, compared several signatures, and nodded once before returning the folder. No announcement was made. No dramatic reaction followed. Yet something subtle changed in the room. The confidence that had surrounded the government's case began to feel less certain. Officer Daniel Brooks noticed the interruption but dismissed it almost immediately. Courtrooms handled paperwork every day. There was no reason to believe these documents had anything to do with him. He relaxed his shoulders and looked toward the prosecutor, expecting the hearing to continue exactly as planned. Instead, the judge asked everyone to remain seated while several procedural matters were reviewed. The unexpected delay stretched for another minute. Then another. The silence became heavier with each passing second. Imagine believing you are only moments away from walking out of a courtroom with your reputation stronger than ever, while somewhere just beyond your field of vision every piece of the puzzle is quietly moving into its proper place. That is the strange thing about the truth. It rarely arrives in a hurry. It waits until every unnecessary word has already been spoken. Naomi Carter remained completely composed. She lowered her eyes for only a moment before looking toward the rear entrance again. The man carrying the leather portfolio stood calmly after receiving a nearly invisible nod from the woman seated several rows away. Neither appeared nervous. Neither rushed. They simply walked toward the front of the courtroom with the quiet confidence of people following a carefully established procedure rather than reacting to unexpected events. Several spectators assumed they were attorneys arriving for another hearing. Even the reporters barely looked up from their notebooks. Daniel watched them only briefly before returning his attention to the judge. The defense attorney remained seated, making no attempt to interrupt the unusual sequence of events. He folded his hands together on the table and waited. His calmness contrasted sharply with the prosecutor, who now seemed uncertain whether to continue questioning or remain silent. The judge finally looked toward counsel for both sides and asked a simple question. Had either party received any communication from a federal agency concerning the matters discussed during today's testimony? The prosecutor answered that no such communication had been disclosed to the government. The defense attorney replied that he had no objection to the court reviewing any properly submitted federal documentation. Daniel felt a brief sense of confusion. Federal documentation. The phrase lingered in his mind longer than he expected. He remembered stating under oath only minutes earlier that no federal agency had ever contacted his department regarding Naomi Carter. He reminded himself that his testimony had been consistent from beginning to end. There was nothing to worry about. Yet for the first time that morning, certainty no longer came as easily as before. The judge accepted the newly delivered materials and instructed the clerk to mark them for identification pending further review. Around the courtroom, even the smallest sound seemed louder than before. A page turned. A chair shifted slightly. Someone quietly cleared a throat near the back row. Naomi watched none of it. Her attention remained fixed on Daniel, whose confident expression had changed almost imperceptibly. It was not fear. Not yet. It was the unmistakable look of someone realizing that the story he had carefully constructed was about to be measured against something he had never expected to enter the courtroom at all. The judge rested both hands on the bench and looked across the courtroom with measured patience before speaking. His voice remained calm, but every person present immediately recognized that the hearing had entered unfamiliar territory. He instructed the clerk to receive the newly submitted federal documents into the record for preliminary review. The courtroom clerk carefully carried the folder to the bench while the attorneys watched in complete silence. Officer Daniel Brooks tried to maintain the same composed expression that had served him well throughout the morning, but for the first time his attention drifted away from the prosecutor and settled on the sealed documents. They had become the only thing in the room he could not explain. Imagine spending hours controlling every conversation, every question, and every impression, only to discover that the one piece of information you never anticipated has finally arrived. Confidence does not disappear all at once. It fades quietly, almost invisibly, one unanswered question at a time. The judge reviewed several pages before looking toward the man who had entered earlier carrying the leather portfolio. He identified himself only after receiving permission from the court, presenting official credentials that confirmed he was appearing on behalf of a federal agency with authorization to address a matter directly connected to the testimony already given under oath. The gallery became completely still. Reporters stopped typing. Even the jurors leaned forward with renewed attention. The prosecutor glanced through his own files, searching for an explanation that was not there. The defense attorney remained perfectly calm, as though this moment had been expected all along. The federal representative explained that the purpose of his appearance was not to argue the underlying criminal allegations but to clarify information that had become directly relevant after the sworn testimony presented that morning. He requested permission to submit authenticated records confirming the identity and official assignment of an individual already present inside the courtroom. Daniel felt a quiet uneasiness settle into his thoughts. He immediately remembered repeating more than once that no federal agency had contacted his department and that Naomi Carter had no connection to any federal investigation. Those statements had sounded unquestionable only minutes earlier. Now they seemed to linger in the courtroom with an entirely different weight. The judge examined another document before raising his eyes toward Naomi. For the first time since the hearing began, he addressed her directly by her full name and asked whether she wished to confirm the information contained in the submitted records. Naomi slowly stood. The room watched in complete silence. Her posture remained calm, her expression steady, and her voice carried neither anger nor satisfaction. She simply answered that the documents accurately reflected her identity and official assignment. The federal representative then presented agency credentials for inspection by the court together with documentation confirming that Naomi Carter had been serving in an authorized investigative capacity connected to an ongoing federal inquiry. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing for a single moment. Daniel stared across the room, trying to reconcile the composed woman he had described as an ordinary suspect with the official records now resting before the judge. The reporters hurried to revise their notes. Several jurors exchanged astonished glances before returning their attention to the bench. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No voices had been raised. Yet the balance of the entire hearing shifted in a single quiet instant. The woman who had patiently endured every accusation without interruption was no longer defined by the handcuffs she had worn when entering the courtroom. She was now recognized through the authority she had carried all along, and every statement that had been made about her under oath was about to be measured against that newly acknowledged truth. The courtroom remained silent long after the federal credentials had been accepted into the record. Nobody seemed willing to speak first. The meaning of the last few minutes settled over the room with extraordinary weight. Officer Daniel Brooks remained seated on the witness stand, his earlier confidence replaced by careful uncertainty. He looked toward the prosecutor, expecting an immediate explanation, but none came. The prosecutor quietly reviewed the newly submitted documents, turning each page more slowly than the last. The certainty that had defined the government's presentation throughout the morning had begun to dissolve beneath verified federal records that could not simply be dismissed. Imagine realizing that the person you underestimated never needed to argue because the evidence was always going to speak louder than emotion. The strongest reversals rarely begin with dramatic speeches. They begin when facts quietly replace assumptions. Naomi Carter stood with the same calm dignity she had carried from the moment she entered the courtroom. Her voice remained steady as she answered several limited questions from the judge regarding her official assignment. She revealed only those details authorized for disclosure, carefully respecting the boundaries of an active federal investigation. Every answer was concise, professional, and supported by authenticated documentation already before the court. There was no celebration in her expression. No satisfaction at seeing the room change around her. She simply respected the process that she had trusted from the beginning. The federal representative then requested permission to submit additional certified records showing the chain of authorization connected to Naomi's assignment. The judge reviewed each page before directing the clerk to include them in the official record. One document confirmed that multiple agencies had coordinated investigative activity over several months. Another established the timeline of authorized operations. Together, the records created an unmistakable contrast with several statements that had already been made under oath earlier that morning. The defense attorney remained seated, saying very little. He understood that the documents were now speaking for themselves. The jurors watched carefully as the judge compared testimony with the authenticated records. Several reporters quietly rewrote their opening paragraphs, recognizing that the story unfolding before them no longer resembled the one they had expected to publish. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the witness stand for the first time that day. He replayed his testimony in his own mind, remembering each confident answer he had given only minutes earlier. Statements that had sounded convincing now carried entirely different consequences when placed beside verified federal documentation. The courtroom was no longer focused on Naomi's credibility. Every question had shifted toward the accuracy of the testimony already preserved in the official transcript. The judge finally looked across the courtroom before explaining that the newly admitted records raised significant issues requiring careful legal review. He emphasized that the integrity of sworn testimony remained fundamental to the justice system and that any material inconsistencies between testimony and authenticated evidence would receive appropriate judicial consideration under established legal procedures. His words were measured, deliberate, and free of emotion, yet they carried enormous weight. Naomi quietly resumed her seat without saying another word. The handcuffs that had defined how many people first perceived her no longer shaped the room's understanding of who she was. Instead, professionalism, patience, and verified facts had completely transformed the narrative. Around the courtroom, people who had entered believing they already knew the truth now recognized how quickly appearances could collapse when examined beside reliable evidence. Daniel remained motionless, understanding at last that authority alone had never guaranteed credibility. In that courtroom, credibility now belonged to the person who had trusted the truth enough to wait for the right moment to reveal it. By the time the hearing came to a close, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had been transformed in a way that nobody could have predicted when the morning began. The same room that had once accepted assumptions without hesitation now carried a renewed respect for patience, evidence, and the quiet discipline of allowing the legal process to unfold. The judge thanked all parties for their professionalism and reminded everyone present that the court existed for one purpose above all others: to pursue the truth through verified facts rather than appearances or personal confidence. Those words settled over the courtroom with lasting significance. Officer Daniel Brooks remained seated for a brief moment before slowly stepping away from the witness stand. His confident posture from earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable weight of reflection. The certainty that had once surrounded every answer he delivered under oath had been replaced by the realization that every statement given in a courtroom carries lasting responsibility. Around him, reporters carefully revised their notes one final time, recognizing that the story they would publish was no longer about quick assumptions or dramatic accusations. It had become a story about accountability and the importance of letting verified evidence guide public judgment. Imagine walking into a room believing that your title alone would define how people remembered you, only to leave understanding that character is measured not by authority, but by honesty when the truth is tested. That lesson cannot be learned from a handbook or a courtroom lecture. It can only be learned when confidence meets accountability. Naomi Carter quietly thanked her attorney before turning toward the federal representative who had stood beside procedure instead of publicity throughout the hearing. They exchanged only a few professional words before preparing to leave. There were no victory speeches. No celebration. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Naomi understood that genuine justice never depends upon humiliation. It depends upon integrity remaining stronger than deception, even when deception appears convincing for a while. As she walked toward the courtroom doors, several members of the gallery looked at her with entirely different eyes than they had only hours before. Earlier they had seen a woman defined by handcuffs and accusations. Now they saw someone whose patience, professionalism, and trust in the legal process had quietly changed the direction of an entire proceeding without raising her voice even once. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the stone steps as people slowly dispersed into the city. Reporters prepared balanced accounts based upon the official record. Attorneys returned to their offices. Jurors carried home a powerful reminder that first impressions can never replace careful examination of the facts. Naomi paused for only a moment before walking toward a waiting government vehicle. She never looked back at the courthouse. She did not need to. The truth had already remained behind, preserved in sworn testimony, authenticated records, and the permanent record of the court itself. Some people believe justice arrives with noise, anger, or dramatic confrontation. More often, it arrives quietly, one verified fact at a time, until there is no room left for illusion. And perhaps that is the lesson worth remembering long after the courtroom becomes empty. A badge may earn respect, a title may open doors, and confidence may persuade a crowd for a little while, but only truth has the strength to endure every question. Because in the end, the law does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the facts that remain standing after every opinion has faded away.